Before I get into this concept, I have to sort of put some preemptive thoughts and ideas out there. So, here they are. Whoever you are listening, you may be offended by what I'm going to say. But I want it to be clear, so hear it now. I have no intention of offending anyone. So I'm going to be talking about male-female relationships, gender, sexuality, sociology, psychology, and I'm just offering what is my perspective on my limited research. But it seems very interesting to me, so that's why I'm presenting it. It doesn't matter to me whether or not you agree or disagree. What matters is that maybe you give it a listen and just think about it. So listen to the whole thing before you make a decision as to what you think. I'm going to be saying some things about men, about women, about society, about culture. So just take it or leave it. Do what you will. So the topic is there a relationship in societies or civilizations that correlates women's sexual liberation and the destruction of the family unit? Just so you know, I'm not picking on women. I have no qualms with the female human being. I like them. I love them. I think they're wonderful. I'm just asking this question because it's a valid question in our current time. And I've been doing some research, and there are certain people that have pretty good answers as to whether or not this could be true. And the whole point in presenting it is for both men and women to think about it. If you're a woman, think about it. Could it be true? Could it not be true? What does history suggest? What does evolution suggest? And same for a man. Could it be true? Could it not be true? If it is true from a male perspective, do you have any role in it? Are you responsible in any way as a man? Is there anything you could do to change it? Or is there anything you have done to perpetuate it? So, here we go. Is there a relationship in societies that correlates women's sexual liberation and the destruction of the family unit? So, the reason why I'm asking this question is because the family unit in the Western world is clearly breaking apart. I should say broken apart. There's so much divorce, it's out of control. And so now you have children of children, and possibly of children, of divorced family structure, which is really like a broken family structure. So we look to nature to see that everything in nature biologically is balanced, male and female, with the exception of some tiny anomalies. But I'm not going to go into those anomalies. Generally speaking, it's male-female. This is how life procreates, regenerates itself, makes babies. So it's obviously set up that way for a specific reason. According to J.D.Unwin, a British ethnographist, anthropologist, as well as sociologist, in his book called Sex and Culture, there is a correlation. He found that also the restraint of sexual liberation occurs as well and has a direct effect on the industriousness of a culture and its productivity. This also echoes Freud's ideas of sexual sublimation or transmutation as a means of self-sacrifice for the transmutation of sex energy into something higher of value for the group, culture, or society.
In one of the most comprehensive studies of civilizational decline, J.D.Unwin postulates in his book, Sex and Culture, written in 1934, that the main driver for the rise of a civilization is the degree of chastity of the said civilization's women. Unwin, a British social anthropologist at Oxford and Cambridge universities, studied 86 different cultures through 5,000 years of history and found a positive correlation between the cultural achievement of a people and the sexual restraint they observed. Unwin's impetus for the project was to test the Freudian theory that civilizational progress was the product of repressed sexuality. He found that discipline in sexual matters appropriated social energy to more civilizational ends. It's very complicated, but for Unwin, the fabric of society was primarily sexual, and heterosexual monogamy was the optimal arrangement for the planning, building, protecting, and nurturing of the family. If enough heterosexual partners made a monogamous commitment, civilizational energy was directed toward promoting the finest societal foundation possible.
So Unwin and Freud are on the same page. And I'd even say that Nietzsche is on that page, as well as Schopenhauer. Actually, there's quite a few philosophers and anthropologists in the Western world that are on the same page. I would say even Carl Jung was on the same page. We may not have actually pinned it down completely to understand it, but we should definitely consider these folks' ideas because they're pretty bright, intelligent people. So what Unwin is saying is that in biological survival situations, the male and the female rely upon each other and create a deep social bond, emotional connection, in order to make babies and then keep those babies alive in the hardest of times in order to procreate the species. And their bond is a commitment, basically, not to cheat on one another, not to betray one another. There's a trust there. That trust promotes the family unit sticking together, the offspring having a better chance of survival, and then those offspring having offspring, thus making the family unit grow. As the family unit grows, it creates its own culture, or you could even say civilization. And in general terms, we found that as a culture gets extremely large and industrious, they reach a peak. And their industriousness creates wealth. And the more wealth they create, the more freedom and liberation they create for themselves and the time that they spend, how they spend their time. And then oftentimes sexuality becomes liberated. And we see that in liberated social societies. Unwin studied over 5,000 different tribes over a 6,000 year period of documented history. All kinds of documents, some biblical, some scientific, some anthropological, some mythological. But nonetheless, he studied over 5,000 tribes. And the same thing occurred in all of them, more or less, is once the liberation of the sexuality occurred, the family unit eventually broke apart. There was more divorce because the people involved started to put their individual desires over the importance of the group desires. So they started to liberate their sexuality, both men and women, and you could say cheat or create a non-monogamous situation, thus perpetuating a more and more and more broken family. And then that was taught to the children, and the children just grow up and think this is okay and normal.
Without exception, each civilization he studied allowed its success to alter its moral code. According to Unwin, after a nation becomes increasingly liberal with regards to its sexual morality, it loses its cohesion, its impetus, and its purpose. From a chaste moral code, societies gain what he called expansive energy.
And I actually would like to point out that I think this is what's happening right now in the Western world, all across Europe and also in America. So I'm not calling anyone out and saying, hey, you need to change your sexual behavior. That's not my position at all. I come from an individualist background. I'm an individual. You make your own choices. But I am providing this information so that maybe you could think about your choices in a new way. Okay, so going on, Unwin discovered that there was a correlation to the industriousness of a culture and its productivity based on its sexual liberation or restraint of sexual liberation. Now, the reason why I'm saying, does this correlation to women's sexual liberation correlate to the destruction of the family unit? It's not that I'm picking on women. It's that biologically speaking, the human species is dictated by the female's decision to choose a mate, much more often than the other way around. So the females, in the biological sense, are the gatekeepers of sexuality. And this goes down to the way in which our bodies and physiology is made. The woman has one precious egg each month, while the man has millions, maybe billions of sperm all the time. So at any time, the man has a billion opportunities to send its energy forth for procreation, but the woman has specific times in which she is open, menstruating or not menstruating, ready or not ready, and there's only one egg at a time. And so she has a different perspective on choice. She's trying to choose what is going to be the best genetic gene to pass on, in her opinion. So that's why this is focused on the female. It's not an attack or anything like that. Okay, moving on. Unwin found over 5,000 tribes that exercise prenuptial and postnuptial sexual restraint made for higher forms of civilization over time, and that when societies achieved a mass of wealth, that they eventually loosened their sexual desires and liberated them. And the females, which in turn cause a value shift and the lack of male-female marital bonds. Kind of what I already said there. This in turn passed on to younger children and the generation, invent and create a productive matriarchy that is empowered. These groups fell apart or often were taken over by stronger, more cohesive groups with a more male-dominated or patriarchy ideology. See the current situation in Europe today. Okay, so what that's about is, as a culture becomes more and more and more sexually liberated, they spend less and less time being industrious and inventive, and they basically get lazy. And this is a pretty simple biological experiment when you look at animals that are predatory. If they're fed and just recently sexually satisfied, they never attack you. They have no desire. They're not in a predatory state. They're basically satiated and lazy. And so a whole culture can get to this point. And that's what Unwin is saying from a biological perspective, that whole groups can get to this point. And when that happens, they're easily taken over by neighboring tribes with a much more aggressive ideology or just a more industrious ideology. And I think that's what's happening across Europe right now. The Western world needs to wake up and address this situation. I'm not necessarily putting forth solutions how they should address it, but I think a lot of people are just ignoring that it's happening. So it needs to be talked about. Again, I'm not trying to offend anybody, but the truth is an offense, but not a sin, quoting Mr. Bob Marley. So you could also see the connection between the female gatekeeper and the sexual gate. So I would say to see Jordan Peterson's work on the biological nature of dominance hierarchies in mammals, but it's really not limited to mammals at all. It's almost throughout the entire animal kingdom. Dominance hierarchies are usually set up to where men compete and fight for power, influence, and the right to mate. And many people look at this as a patriarchal movement in nature, but Jordan Peterson actually points out that the dominance hierarchies are actually upheld and sometimes created and definitely sustained by the female, simply because she's the one choosing. So the fact that men are competing for the right to mate, it's one of her ways, if not the most primary way, that she is able to choose what she thinks is the greatest genetic seed. She doesn't necessarily know what's the way to choose the best genetic male, so she lets them fight it out and even promotes that oftentimes, and just assumes that whoever wins the fight must be the best, which is obviously not always true. So here's Jordan Peterson.
They chase away the subordinates. It's not because the females exercise choice. Human females exercise choice. And that's one of the things that differentiated us from chimpanzees. But how do they do it? Well, they look at the male dominance hierarchy. And that's where the men are competing. Now, you could say they're competing for power, but that's a pretty corrupt way of looking at it. Like, they're competing for, let's say, influence. They're competing for leadership. And so, in some sense, the people at the top of the hierarchy, if their men are elected by the other men. Now, I know there's brutes and there's predators and all of that, but I'm talking on average across time. It's like the men organize themselves, and there are influential men that rise to the top, and the women take them. Now, you think about that. What that means is that over the millions of years that a dominance hierarchy with those properties existed, so let's say since we split from chimps, let's say that's 6 million years, that means that the male dominance hierarchy is the environment that pushes the mating male to the top. So that means the male that's most likely to take precedence in the male dominance hierarchy is the one most likely to leave a genetic contribution. So that means that the male dominance hierarchy is a selection mechanism mediated by the female. So what that means is that as we've moved forward through 6 million years of time, men have become more and more well adapted not only to the presence of the male dominance hierarchy, but to the ability to move up it. And that's the central spirit, you could say, in some sense.
Okay, so you can see Jordan Peterson talking about that. I know that's just a soundbite, but his work is pretty awesome if you want to look into it. And I like to point out the influence of those hierarchies, again, in Europe and in America right now, with the Western ideology being sort of attacked under different ideologies, and why that is and why that's occurring. So I think it's a postmodernist movement, which is actually a very destructive movement in my mind, because it's not rooted in it's not actually rooted in any logical philosophy. It's sort of, how do I say it? It's a sadistic or sadist philosophy of self-hate or self-denial. It's very nihilistic and thus not industrious and moving the culture forward. It's actually breaking down the culture. And I think it's going to have to, I think it sows the seeds of its own destruction.
According to Unwin, after a nation becomes prosperous, it becomes increasingly liberal with regard to sexual morality, and as a result loses its cohesion, its impetus, and its purpose. The process, says the author, is irreversible. The whole of human history does not contain a single instance of a group becoming civilized unless it has been absolutely monogamous, nor is there any example of a group retaining its culture after it has adopted less rigorous customs.
And you could also definitely go into the rise of the MGTOW movement, MGTOW, which is men going their own way. Like, you have to ask yourself, when did this happen, and then why did it happen? And it's actually a pretty large social movement. It's pretty easy to see when you listen to the philosophy and ideology of it. It's a direct response to the feminist movement. So it's good to look at both sides of the coin and understand what the impacts of feminism has had on the modern man, and why the MGTOW movement even exists in the first place, and maybe where it's going or what it's going to do to society in the future. So I'm just going to spit out some words here because I'm into words and etymology. So, for example, the word family. Family is fa, ma, li, right? So fa is father, ma is mother. It's pretty obvious that in order to have a family, you need a father-mother union, a father-mother balance. And if you don't have that union or balance, then you get, the family unit gets broken apart. And that's actually what's happening and has happened culturally since the feminist movement, and since that movement was basically driven by power structures to have two people in the family being taxed instead of one. And we see that that's great for the people at the top of the social hierarchy, the wealthiest 1% of 1%, but it's actually destroying the family and the family unit, and it's destroying the institution of marriage. And you also see that as the institution of marriage gets destroyed, sexual liberation rises. So you start having unions that are that are promoted for different reasons, for tax reasons, for business reasons, for property ownership reasons, and they're not based in the foundations of keeping a society strong, industrious, and productive. They're just basically profit-driven, money-driven. Something to think about. Some other words, female and male, right? Well, female is just the word male with "fee" in front of it. And there is a etymological twist that I've read in the work of William Lawrence Lyons that says the female is the fee, just like in feline, a feline, a female lion. The fee, the Fe, actually refers to the element of iron in the blood. So the symbol for iron is Fe, fee. And so a female is a male with a lot of iron in their blood, right? So their hormones are different, their chemistry is different. Something to think about there. Females are also, according to the MGTOW movement, as well as Unwin and there's other people I could quote as well, but females are generally biologically hypergamous. We see this in mammals, and hypergamy means hyper game, right? Gam means game, so hyper game. The hyper game is the most intense game and the fastest way to move up in social hierarchies. So females tend to be hypergamous in their nature, meaning they mate on an equal level or on a higher level than their own social status. And the reason why they do this is genetically they're trying to support the offspring or the potential offspring if it hasn't come yet. And so you need a certain amount of wealth, protection, stability, security in order to do that. So the hypergamous nature of females is not something I'm attacking. I actually admire it to some degree. I can see why it would be a biological choice to do that. But it's also very good to know, if you're a female, that you are this way, potentially. And also, if you're a male, to know that females, like your girlfriend or wife or mother or grandmother, might be this way, and how that affects society and how that affects the family. It's also in the brilliant works of William Lawrence Lyons, The Language Crystal. He talks about the word monogamy, which is monogame, right? The one game, mono meaning one. Well, monogamy was apparently invented by the female to promote society and civilization as her desire to become more and more civilized, because biologically speaking, since men have billions of sperm and she only has one egg, there is more men usually mating with one woman. And this creates a problem. But the reason why it's designed that way is because men typically would inseminate a woman, and this is throughout the animal kingdom, and then not stick around. They would impregnate and then not raise the child. They would move on. They would go do what they do, hunt, and sort of protect and provide food and security and that sort of thing. So human beings are somewhat biologically programmed this way as well. And so the monogame was something she invented to say, hey, look, I will give you open the gate to sexuality, but you have to help raise the offspring, meaning you have to stick around. So the monogame is the woman selecting one man and then enticing him to stick around and raise the child. Now, the monogame we see is actually dictated by light, by solar light. This is a fascinating topic that I actually write about in my book, Sun King, because it's all about the harmonics of solar light. But to simplify it, and it's not simple, there's a relationship between sunlight and female cycles. And there's a relationship between that sunlight bouncing off the moon, which is where we get the word men for menstrual, and where we get the word month for moon. So when a woman is on her moon, it's a monthly cycle. Now, that cycle in mammals is called estrus, another pointing to the stars. The word estra means star. So estrus is literally the harmonics of the female physiological hormone system being regulated by starlight. And the ancient Hermeticists and Greeks and a lot of Europe, the alchemists, they all knew this and taught this, that not only females are regulated by sunlight, males are too. We all are. Without the sun, we have no life. So the sunlight bouncing off the moon regulates the estrus cycle in many mammals being 17 to 21 days on an average. And there are different hormonal cycles within that cycle as to when she is receptive. There's also different chemicals that regulate this cycle that would make you more female or more male. So these cycles of light dictate the amount of iron in your blood, as well as all these other chemicals. So the pituitary body secreting certain chemicals, and the pineal body secreting certain chemicals, causing the hormones of a more female-oriented being or a more male-oriented being. So much so that if you are a female and you have a uterus, there's actually a predilection to being mounted. I know that sounds intense and crazy, but this is actually goes back to the dominance hierarchies. Men do not like to be mounted. If you have a high level of testosterone and you are competitive in nature, being mounted by any other creature is a sign of submission. And we see that females actually in their uterus have contractions that draw in the seminal fluid of the male when mounted, so much so that the uterus contracts and draws in. So you can see there's a totally different chemistry going on psychologically between male and female. They play different games, but for the same purpose, to procreate the species and to create civilization. Unwin also points out that, and so does Lyons, that the idea of civilization is probably one that the female desired but didn't know how to carry out. So it's the female desire for civilization that would procreate the human species and give it its best chance of survival, but it's the males that carry out that desire, because males tend to be more intellectual. The starlight of the sun is said to be intellectual, whereas the backdrop of darkness, like the night sky with the moon, is said to be female. So even in Carlos Castaneda's work and the Toltec work, which is all about the concept, the Toltecs call themselves the people of the navel of the moon, right? So they are interested in exploring the infinite, called the Nagual, and the infinite Nagual is predominantly female in their teachings, and predatory, which is interesting. Now, it's not predatory in the sense that it's out to kill everything. It's predatory in the sense that it's out to do whatever it takes to make life continue, to procreate, to make life move on. And so it is said that the darkness out there is female, and that's also more abundant than the light. But the starlight, the stars, and the suns are male. And this is exactly why, back to words and etymology, this is exactly why young boys are called your sun, right? It's directly related to solar light, the sun. So anyway, estrus, the star cycle, is what dictates a female's ability to make, create, sustain an egg in the womb. Totally dictated by light. Back to Unwin, as far as society and culture goes, he points out that there has never been a prosperous society with a declining population. Actually, that's not Unwin, I'm sorry. That's Phil Longman. He wrote a book called The Empty Cradle. And he says that, let me repeat that. There's never been a prosperous society with a declining population. So we also see the birth rates of many European countries significantly dropping across Europe. I think the average across Europe is like 1.2 children per family. While in Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and parts, I can't quote Asia, but definitely Africa, it's almost double that. It's like 3 something per family. So the declining birth rates are actually a reflection of sexual liberation and the family unit being broken apart. So it's key to understand the correlations. When you look at a population whose birth rates are steadily declining, their interest in monogamy and their interest in the family unit has dropped way low, and so thus their offspring, their next generation has also dwindled. So it's interesting to think about that. Prosperity of society and civilization is directly related to demographics, to the amount of children that you have.
After a careful evaluation of a variety of civilizations, including the Romans, Greeks, Sumerians, Moors, Babylonians, and Anglo-Saxons, a clear pattern emerged for Unwin. a perfect correlation between sexual fidelity and civilizational flourishment. Unwin found that discipline in sexual matters appropriated social energy to more civilizational ends, validating Freudian sublimation on a societal level. So, Unwin remarks, the evidence is that in the past, a class has risen to a position of political dominance because of its great energy, and that at the period of its rising, its sexual regulations have always been strict. It has retained its energy and dominated the society so long as its sexual regulations have demanded both prenuptial and postnuptial continence. I know of no exception to these rules. But what exactly were those strict sexual attitudes and regulations that contributed to societal flourishing? Well, the answer, heterosexual monogamy. For Unwin, the fabric of society was primarily sexual, and heterosexual monogamy was the optimal arrangement for planning, building, protecting, and nurturing the family. If enough heterosexual partners made a monogamous commitment, civilizational energy was directed towards promoting the firmest societal foundation possible, the family.
And we can see this also, part of this happening because the hypergamy of female nature has been perpetuated by laws and courts to be monetized or make money off of this. So you see that the court systems are the ones who make all the money when people get divorced, right? Lawyers and judges and all the way up. It doesn't matter who wins the case, lawyers and judges and the court system gets paid regardless. So they've built in laws, sort of are liberal enough to be feminist-based laws in many Western countries, to where it's actually being taught as a culture from mother to daughter that, you know, marrying a man and then divorcing him is a way to be hypergamous. It's a way to move up in the social stratification. You get paid, basically. You can take a certain portion of the income, even if you didn't work or contribute. And this is a direct relation to the lack of productivity of offspring, as well as the family unit being broken apart and monetized by a system where the state sort of replaces the authority. The state becomes the father, the state becomes the mother, and the state becomes the authority. Something we need to take back. Sociologically, it's sort of, according to Unwin, at some point it becomes irreversible. It basically, the system destroys itself and everything falls apart. Every institution that was built on previous male-female, patriarchal and matriarchal balanced institutions, they fall apart when this happens. So we have to find a way to find course correction for this issue. Speaking of inventions, we see that civilizations are usually built by the male energy, right? You can see who's swinging hammers and building buildings and creating architecture and building science and even mathematics. It's not that females don't have the ability to do this stuff. It's that their predilection, their desire is less in the intellectual side of things and more in the emotional side of things. So you could just go through the inventions of the last, say, you could say, I don't know, 3,000 years. The greatest inventions you could possibly think of, you know, the printing press, to lasers, to nanotechnology, to cell phones, to the internet, to the wheel, for example, the wielding of fire. Every invention you can probably think of, over 90% of those inventions were created and built by men. And so you have to ask yourself why that is, biologically speaking. And there is a reason for that. It's the hypergamy of women. Their desire for civilization is very strong, but their desire to carry it out is not. So they enlist men to carry this out, to do this type of work. And this is why men tend to be intellectually based. They want to fix things. They want to solve problems, right? Because they believe that that's what the woman wants. Going back to some symbols of ancient times, the symbol of Hermes, right? Hermes, the hermaphrodite, or the hermetically sealed, it basically means clean and balanced. But it's important to know that Hermes was not a physical being. It's a symbol that we have created to talk about or promote spiritual balance. So the androgyny is in the spirit, because we know deep down inside that the spirit is both male and female, or neither, depending on how you look at it. Yin and yang, everything is unified basically in spirit. So Hermes symbolizes mental, emotional, and spiritual balance, not a transgender being, not some sort of androgynous, hermaphrodite. So it's important to know that. It's someone who is intellectually capable and emotionally capable of understanding both male and female natures within themselves, but also physically whatever they were biologically born as. If you're born a man, you're a man. If you're born a woman, you're a woman. And embodying those things throughout. Back to Unwin, quoting, "Heterosexual monogamy is the optimal arrangement for planning, building, and creating civilization or society. And if enough heterosexual partners made a monogamous commitment at and toward promoting the firmest societal foundation possible, it would be the family." So he's basically saying that heterosexual monogamy is the basis of marriage, but it's also the basis of a society or a civilization that will last. Something to think about.